I want to urge everyone to turn off your cell phone, and if you could be on mute until you are speaking.
Airplane mode works really well.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to start in a few minutes. Go run and get lunch and come back, as long as there's no plastic packaging on your lunch.
There's a strong noise. I don't know if it comes from.
Yeah, Shauna, could you go on mute? We're getting some weird background. It may not be you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this exciting webinar hosted by Beyond Plastics. My name is Judith Ank. I am the president and the founder of Beyond Plastics. We're based at Bennington College, and we have the very modest goal of working to stop plastic pollution everywhere, and we're serious about everywhere. I served in the Obama administration as regional administrator at the Environmental Protection Agency. And when I left EPA, I had to decide what to do when I grew up. And I wanted to work on a really challenging issue where there was an unmet need, where we needed more education, more community organizing, and more advocacy. So of course, I decided to focus on plastics. I want to thank my colleagues, Eve Fox, Ayla West, and Jennifer Congdon for helping to organize this exciting webinar today. This is a multifaceted issue. In our work at Beyond Plastics, we deal with plastic production, use, and disposal. Plastics is very much a climate change issue. The boom in fracked gas has spurred massive new investments in plastic manufacturing facilities. I think what's happening is the fossil fuel industry sees reduced demand for their product, for electricity and transportation, as we shift to renewable energy and electric vehicles. And they look at plastic production as their plan B to make them economically viable. By 2025, plastic production capacity is expected to increase by 33% to 36%, mostly for ethylene and propylene facilities. We know that there are about 47 new or expanded ethane cracker facility proposals in the country, mostly in Texas and Louisiana, mostly in low-income communities and communities of color. When you work on this issue, one of the first things you hear is, well, can't we just recycle all of the plastic? And while I'm a huge booster of recycling, I'm sorry to share with you that plastic recycling has been an abysmal failure, only achieving an 8.5% recycling rate. On top of that, a lot of plastic gets littered on streets and beaches, and we are seeing 15 million metric tons of plastic enter our rivers and our oceans each and every year. My conclusion is that we are turning our ocean into a landfill. When you turn to the disposal of plastics, often it is burned at municipal waste incinerators where dioxin is formed. And again, the common denominator here is that these garbage incinerators are almost always sited in low-income communities or communities of color around the world. So this is a major environmental justice issue. You can get more information on our work at beyondplastics.org. That's plastics with an S. Also, a shameless little plug here. Feel free to take my online class on plastic pollution. Bennington College was one of the first colleges in the country to offer a plastic pollution class. And during COVID, we shifted online. Most of the students are community people who are auditing the class. The next class starts September 1st, every Wednesday night, 7 weeks, and it's cheap. It's only $100. And you can register at this point by going to CAPA at bennington.edu. It's a little bit more expensive if you're a college student taking the class for credit, which some do. So as you may know, May is Women's Health Month. And so we are delighted to welcome 3 people who know a lot about women's health and toxics and plastics. Remember, plastic used to be made from oil and chemicals. Plastic is now made from ethane, a waste product of fracking, and chemicals. But chemicals has been the through line on plastic production for years. The way this is going to unfold today is we're going to hear from 3 spectacularly well-informed, brilliant speakers. And then after each, all 3 speak, not each, but after all 3 speak, we will take questions. And the way we will take questions is go to the bottom, the toolbar, and where it says Q&A, not chat. Do not chat at me during this, but go to Q&A, type in your question. If you're a reporter, tell us you're a reporter and we will get to your question first. If you're a reporter and we don't get to your question, reach out to Eve Fox afterwards and we'll get you the information that we need. So I'm really delighted to welcome our first speaker this afternoon, Dr. Shauna Swann, who is one of the world's leading environmental and reproductive epidemiologists in the world. She is a professor of environmental medicine and public health at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City. She is an award-winning scientist. For years, her work has examined the impact of environmental contaminants on children. And Dr. Swann is the co-author of this phenomenal new book called Countdown. If you haven't read it yet, you should. It was just published this past February, and we will also hear from Stacy Colino, the co-author on this book. So, Dr. Swann, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Judith, so much for the invitation to speak. And thank you to your wonderful work that you've on plastics, which has been so important in spreading information and also hopefully getting change that we need to happen to reduce our exposures. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to, first of all, my title, Threatened Reproduction, Causes, Consequences, and Solutions. That's a pretty big lift, if you will. Has to do with males and females, lots of causes, lots of consequences, and solutions. I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes. And so I'm only going to touch on these things. But as Judith said, you can learn more in our book, Countdown. So let me start with the roadmap for my talk. I'm going to, as I told you, talk about problems, causes, consequences, and solutions in that order. And let's start talking about the problem. And the first thing I want to say about the problem is that unlike these scientists who are keyed in and extremely interested in this problem, when they hear Houston, we got a problem, the most of the scientific world is not there yet. And so I think our first problem is that we have to get our problem, which I'm going to outline for you, recognized so that this kind of attention can be brought to it, because otherwise I don't think that we can bring about change. So what triggered Countdown was a paper that I and my colleagues published in 2017. And that was a very large and complete meta-analysis which addressed the question, has sperm concentration or count declined? If so, at what rate? And the first thing I have to tell you is that most of the data we were able to find in our very extensive literature search of published literature in English language was that we could only find studies which were really informative in Western countries. This was a disappointment. There had been prior studies where most of the data had been in Western countries, but I had hoped that by this time we'd have some other countries chiming in here, but still not enough information to make any conclusions. But what we did conclude in Western countries was that between samples collected in 1973 and samples collected in 2011, that's about 39 years, the sperm concentration, that is the number of sperm per milliliter, it's a density, that was 99 million sperm per milliliter in 1973, a hefty number, a very good sperm concentration, and it had declined in 39 years, less than 2 generations, to 47 million per milliliter, which is a 52% decline. This is a little bit faster than 1% per year or 10% per 10 years. Now, if you think about 10 years from now, we're at 2021, 10 years past that 2011 point. And so our best guess of the sperm concentration in Western countries right now is 37 million per milliliter. What's critical about that is we don't know exactly, of course, you can't project without the data, but it's likely that that number is below 40. And in our business, 40 is very important because 40 million per milliliter is that point at which it gets harder and harder to conceive a pregnancy. So I've been asked what happens when it hits 0. These are medians, the middle value of the distribution. They cannot actually hit 0 because then half of the sperm would be negative, not possible. However, we know that these have to veer off somehow, and the question is how fast. So it's not just sperm count. It's also the shape of the sperm, how well they move, their chromosomal integrity, but it's other issues besides sperm. And I'm going to talk about a few of those. One I want to point out is that we're also seeing reductions in testosterone. We're seeing an increase in male genital birth defects. In females, we're seeing an increase in miscarriage, and we're seeing premature ovarian failure, depletion of adequate eggs. And these changes are occurring at approximately the same rate, which is interesting because it suggests a common cause. So what might that cause be? Well, I like to separate causes broadly into genetic and environment, first of all, and point out that genetics is not going to explain this because this is a change that's happening, and these changes are happening over 2 generations. So that big a change over 2 generations is not going to be evolutionary. Environment has to play a role, although gene environment can interact. So if we go to environment, we can talk about chemical exposures and lifestyle factors. Most of my work has been on chemical exposures, although I've also studied lifestyle factors, and I'll say a few words about that. But most of what I'm going to say, and this is the plastic invasion webinar, is going to be about chemicals. And among chemicals, there are what's called the endocrine disrupting chemicals, those chemicals that can alter the body's natural hormones. And these are very important for reproduction, which is what I study. And the other chemicals are also important. There's metals, but I'm going to focus on the endocrine disrupting chemicals. And among those, particularly the plasticizers, and my work has been primarily on phthalates and bisphenols, but there's other excellent work showing that in all of these categories, we can have impacts on reproductive function. So it turns out that testosterone is really critical for reproductive health. And so let's just go in depth a little bit in these plastics and think about what can interfere with testosterone. This is an image of testosterone molecule. So chemicals in personal care products, phthalates, help this product to retain its color and also its scent. So anything scented. They also help products enter the body, so they increase absorption. And for that reason, they're put in personal care products. Phthalates in household products like shower curtains, and perhaps not so obviously in tubing in many, many ways, which we don't see, but we experience through, for example, the milk coming through these tubes. These can lower testosterone. So phthalates, many of them are what's called anti-androgens, testosterone lowering, and this is a problem for reproduction. Why? Because early in pregnancy, the genitals in this little cartoon, if you will, as shown on the left, are undifferentiated. They're the same in males and females. Then when testosterone comes along at the critical time in pregnancy, then that undifferentiated genital tract becomes masculinized, becomes male typical. That is a genetic male. And if the testosterone is not pregnant, that doesn't happen. And the default is the female genital tract. Okay? So what happens when the mother is exposed to phthalate at the critical time when this is occurring? Here on the left, you see the testosterone peak that we would like to see in mid-pregnancy, actually early pregnancy, gestational days here about 18 to 21. There is an expected rise in testosterone. However, on the right, when the mom is exposed to phthalates, and in this experiment, it was diethyl hexyl phthalate, a very anti-androgenic phthalate, the testosterone peak was completely wiped out. And so this little mouse that's going to be exposed to this phthalate is going to be in trouble in terms of developing his genitals. In fact, what happens, he develops something called the Phthalate Syndrome. And just note that this is pretty unusual to name a syndrome after a chemical class. One other is alcohol, but I don't know of any others. So this is really important, and it's been, the basis of a lot of research. And this syndrome includes disturbances in genital development, including a smaller penis, also malformations of the penis. testes might be undescended, and their distance, the perineal distance from the anus to the genitals, called the AGD, is shortened. That's important because that is supposed to be long in a male, 50 to 100% longer than in a female, but under the influence of phthalate, that growth does not happen. So I learned in about 2000 that our pregnant women in the United States and all over the world, we later learned, are exposed to these phthalates on a regular basis. Probably 95% of them are exposed. And so we could say, okay, are these phthalates that the mother is exposed to going to act on her the way they did on that little rodent mom when she was pregnant? In other words, would we expect to see these changes, and what would they look like in a human? So I decided to do that study. I got NIHS funding, and I had a study that I had, in which I had collected urine from the mothers and stored it, not knowing when I would use it, but luckily I had it. And then we could bring the babies back and we could measure. And so we decided, how would we measure those changes that had been seen in a rodent? Well, it turns out you can translate this quite well. Using calipers, you can measure these things. And what we found was, yes, we did confirm the phthalate syndrome in humans. We found that prenatal phthalate exposure, and it turned out later to be in early first trimester, causes the phthalate syndrome in human males. I use the word cause carefully here because we have a large literature in animal showing this. We have in vitro evidence showing that these are anti-androgenic. And now we have 2 studies that confirm that phthalates prenatally can induce these changes in humans. So we published it first in 2005. And then, because it was so important, we got funded to replicate it in another large study. And so the conclusion is phthalates cause the phthalate syndrome. Phthalates are anti-androgenic. They are endocrine disruptors. And by the way, this measure that we were using in anogenital distance is an important marker of what the fetus was exposed to in utero, in that black box where we can't actually look. And importantly, this distance turns out to be something that predicts that boy's sperm count when he is old enough to produce sperm. We couldn't look at that in our babies, they were too young, but we learned that this measure was a permanent marker of reproductive development. And so we looked at college students and looked at their measure of this AGD, this perineal length, and we said, is this related to the young man's sperm count? And indeed it was, as you can see in this picture. So let me just take a breath here and tell you what this whole body of research shows. It shows that early exposure to phthalates influence genital development in a permanent way that later plays out in lower sperm count, and it turns out infertility. So phthalates are a very good candidate for one of the things that's making sperm count go down at 1% per year. But I also want to mention that the timing is important. I talked about the timing and showed you for the rats. That timing was important. It's also important for humans, as we showed in our study. But also to mention that timing is important because adult exposure matters, but adult exposure does not matter as much as prenatal exposure. And why is that? Because changes that are brought about prenatally are organizational changes. They're changes that are going to stick with the organism for life. And if a young man smokes or is exposed to phthalates or some other harm, he will see a lowering of sperm count, possibly, but that will not be permanent. He can fix that by changing his behaviors or his exposures. But if the exposure was in utero, it's a stronger effect, and it's also a permanent effect. So timing is really critical. The other thing I wanted to mention about consequences is that multiple species in the planet are being affected by the same chemicals we're exposed to, of course. As Judith very well stated, we're polluting our oceans, we're polluting our environments, and all of these animals have their reproductive health threatened, and some of them are endangered and may even be close to extinction. So, and by the way, they are not choosing this, we are subjecting them to these exposures. So now I'd like to talk briefly about some of the things we can do about this. So the first thing I'd like to mention is surprising to many people, but probably not people on this webinar, that most of the 60, some people say 80 existing chemicals, most of those have not been tested at all. Most of them were grandfathered in. They have other excuses, if you will, for not being tested. And most of those that have been tested have not been adequately tested. So testing is really a very important part of what we need to do, part of the solution. So I'd like to just summarize by giving you 3 takeaways, if you will. The first is that we have to remove chemicals like phthalates, which affect testosterone, like bisphenol A, which is estrogenic, like other chemicals that are hormonally active. They should not be in our lives, and particularly not in the systems of pregnant women. We have to remove chemicals that are harmful at low doses, because that's what we're exposed to. Animals are tested primarily at high doses, and that does not keep us safe. We have to remove chemicals that are environmentally persistent, because otherwise those chemicals in our water, in our landfill, are coming back to us again and again, and we're continually re-exposed. And we must remove the chemicals that have not yet been tested for toxicity. And we have to replace them. And replacements follow obviously from what we want to remove. We want to replace them with chemicals that are not endocrine disruptors, that do not have adverse effects at low doses, are minimally persistent, and very importantly, are shown to be safe prior to marketing, which is not the case in the United States, although under REACH in Europe, it's much more likely to be the case. And finally, we have to regulate these in a way that reflects human exposure. We are exposed to low doses. We must test at low doses. We're exposed to mixtures. We have to test mixtures. We have to regulate environmental persistence out of our environment, if you will, and we have to assess the risks in untested chemicals. So with that, I'm going to stop and just remind you, take a look at Countdown if you can, and if you like it and want to support us, you can use the hashtag #CountMeIn. And now I'd like to turn this over to Judith, who will introduce Stacy.
Thank you, Dr. Swann. That was excellent. I just want to ask, can you give us an easy definition of phthalates? What are they? And I know you showed some examples of what they're.
Okay, well, Stacy's going to give a lot of examples. Maybe I would turn that over to Stacy.
I can wait.
Yeah, they're a class of chemicals in our environment. Stacy will tell you how. Why.
Perfect transition. That was spectacular. Thank you. I'm now privileged to introduce Stacy Colino, who is an award-winning writer specializing in science, health, and psychological issues. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post Health and Wellness sections and in dozens of national magazines. She is the co-author of this wonderful book, Countdown. I'm just going to hold it up all afternoon because I love it so much, especially the chapter on plastics. And Stacy has not only co-authored Countdown, but she's written or collaborated on about a dozen other books. I want to get the list. So I'm really delighted to welcome Stacy Colino.
Thank you, Judith. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'll start by talking about phthalates, which wasn't where I was going to start, but that's fine. So phthalates are ubiquitous in our modern world. It's a large, diverse class of chemicals. They're found in plastics, vinyl, floor and wall coverings, medical tubing and medical devices, toys, a vast array of personal care products. They're basically everywhere. And when we expose ourselves to them, they can get into our bodies. So the $1 million question a lot of people ask is, where do they come from? And as I mentioned, they're basically everywhere. They're in the food and beverages and water we consume. They're in the cosmetics and personal care products we slather on our skin. They're in the air we breathe, and they're in some of the cleaning products we use in our homes. In addition, some other endocrine disrupting chemicals aside from phthalates, such as flame retardants and others, are present in household dust. Some of it comes from dust that comes out of our TVs, for example, and it becomes airborne, or it lands on our rugs or our floors, and we're exposed to it that way. So basically, with all these different exposures, you have to keep in mind, we're not living in a vacuum. We're exposed to all of these on a daily basis. And in a sense, we're doing uncontrolled science experiments on ourselves because we're exposed in so many different ways. It's very hard to pinpoint one exposure having one particular effect because it's basically a toxic soup of exposures. So interestingly, the riskiest rooms for your fertility are your kitchen and bathrooms, not your bedroom, which may surprise some people. And that's because that's where a lot of these chemicals are present. So sadly, right now, the onus is on us as both individuals and consumers to protect ourselves from these harmful culprits. As Shauna mentioned, we need much better testing and much better regulation and regulatory standards, because the onus shouldn't be on us. People don't realize that our government regulatory bodies aren't protecting us from these. There is a presumption in the regulatory process that these chemicals are safe until they're proven otherwise. And that's the opposite of the way things should be. So better testing and better regulation is the ultimate solution in terms of protecting human health. But in the meantime, the reality is we have to take steps to protect ourselves. And there are lots of different ways that we can do that. You'll find an exhaustive list, almost room by room, in the book Countdown, which you've seen several times, and I'll just join the club and hold up my copy. But a couple that I have adopted, I learned an enormous amount working on this book, and I considered myself a very health conscious person to begin with. I've been writing about health and environmental health, reproductive health, you name it, for 25 years. And I learned a lot. So my basic recommendations are to get rid of plastic food containers and water bottles in your home. Replace them with glass, ceramic, or metal ones. You've probably heard that you should never reheat food in plastic because the chemicals from the plastic leach into the food, but that's not enough. So I just say ditch the plastic, period, and replace it. Similarly, replace pans and other cooking devices that have non-stick coatings, which contain chemicals, and find cookware that doesn't have those. Eat unprocessed foods whenever possible. And this is a really important one, but a tricky one. Read the labels of personal care products and cleaning products that you bring into your home to make sure they contain phthalates in particular, but also other endocrine disrupting chemicals. And it's not going to say on the label contains phthalates or contains parabens or contains whatever you want to avoid. You really have to look at the ingredients level to see what it might have that you don't want on your skin or in your body. There's an exhaustive list in the book that you'll find of what to look for. I recommend cutting that out or taking a photo of it with your phone and using it as a cheat sheet when you go shopping. So that will be a big help to you. my advice on all of this is people find all this advice a little bit overwhelming and think, well, how am I really going to make a difference here? How can I protect myself, eliminate these exposures in my life? And my advice is don't let perfect become the enemy of good. Every step you take to either reduce, eliminate, or mitigate your exposure to these chemicals will help. And it will reduce the burden on your body of endocrine disrupting chemicals. And this reduction adds up over time. I do want to spend a moment or two talking about the fact that I've mentioned that we have all these different exposures occurring simultaneously or regularly. In addition, lifestyle habits are also affecting reproductive health and development. It's no secret that we're in the midst of an obesity epidemic. Obesity has been tied with a lot of the reproductive changes that Shauna outlined, increases in miscarriage rates, reductions in sperm counts and testosterone levels, you name it, diminished ovarian reserve, a reduction in good quality eggs as women get older. In addition, smoking is a big problem when it comes to fertility and reproductive health in general. And that's true particularly during pregnancy for a pregnant mother, but also for a man before conception. Other problems related to lifestyle might include stress run amok that can affect the hormones in our bodies and hence our reproductive health, exercise or complete lack thereof, and others. You'll find a whole chapter on this, actually two, a chapter outlining these problems related to lifestyle, as well as another chapter about what you can do about all of these. So basically, it's a complicated picture, but it's one that we can disassemble and we can address the component parts one by one and take steps to not only safeguard our fertility, but our reproductive health over time. And this is important because long past the age of the reproductive years, a lot of these effects on the human body have ripple effects that can affect our health later in life, even our longevity. And so it's worth taking steps to protect yourself and your family at any stage of life.
Thank you, Stacy. That was excellent. And the list in the book is incredibly valuable. We're now going to turn to Dr. Antonio Ragusa. I first learned of his amazing path-breaking work very recently when I read a paper that he co-authored on the presence of microplastics in the human placenta, the first time that was identified. Dr. Ragusa is the director and the head of obstetrics and gynecology at the Isola Tabernia Hospital in Rome. He's the president of the Ragonese Foundation, where he's coordinated numerous Italian national recommendations promulgated by the main scientific societies in Italy. He was a scientific consultant for the Italian Ministry of Health and has published more than 100 scientific papers and 17 books and/or chapters on national and international medical issues. He's currently focused on perinatal medicine, evaluating new techniques for reducing unnecessary cesarean sections, and he's focused on the consequences of plastic pollution on fetal and neonatal health. We're so fortunate to also be joined by Dr. Paolo Forni, who is a developmental biologist at the State University of New York in Albany, who also happens to be fluent in Italian. So he will be providing simultaneous translation for Dr. Ragusa. Dr. Ragusa, thank you so much for joining us from Rome, and the floor is yours. You're on mute, Doctor.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I show my presentation. Are you able to see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes. And so I am Antonio Ragusa. I am sorry for everybody for my English. That is a bad primitive form of English, but I think if I try to speak in your language because I have the help of the slide. And so I hope you can understand what I speak. If I have some difficulty, Paolo can help me. And so let me begin with the production, use, and fate of all plastic ever made. You can see in the slide that scientists have calculated that 7.8 billion tons of virgin plastic have been created worldwide since now. The number, it's already impressive itself, but become even more so when we consider that about half of them have been produced in the last 12 years alone. The question is, what is plastic used for? Because maybe if we use plastic for something of important, is a good thing. But unfortunately, the most of plastic that we produce, we use for packaging. This means that most of the plastic produced today is useless, as if you bought yourself a new coat and after 10 minutes, after unpacking it, you immediately throw it away. Think about bottles of water or soda, for example, totally absurd. Just a little bit minutes of life in this plastic. This slide shows to you the way in which plastic from industry go to the sea, in the surface of the waters, but also in the deep of the waters. A lot of tons per year, more than 8 tons per year. And as Judith told us before, unfortunately, recycle is a business that don't work, because less than 10% of the plastic was recycled. And Judith told us before 8.5 in USA, for example. The majority of plastic produced go in the environment. In particular, microplastic are, you can see some kind of microplastic in this picture. Microplastic are particles smaller than 5 millimeters, deriving from the degradation of plastic present in the environment. You can see here where do they come from, microplastic, from larger plastic product, the clothing, when you're washing clothing, for example, or noodles, or a lot of personal hygiene products. Plastic is everywhere. And but we have to think about that drink and breath microplastic are the majority of microplastic that enter in our body. Put more simply, if we all stopped to buying plastic bottles, we will realize most of our consumption of plastic. Extraordinarily simple, but not so simple, because we don't do this. I told that you can find microplastic everywhere in the Everest balcony, for example, and also in the Mariana Trench, from the top to the down, everywhere. A lot of plastic. And so we try to analyze placenta, and we discovered that in human placenta there is microplastic. We are able to find 12 little pieces of microplastic in 4 of 6 placenta that we have analyzed. You can see in this slide, for example, polypropylene. Polypropylene is a kind of plastic very present in all over the world. We find microplastic everywhere in placenta, in chorionic plate, in fetal size, in maternal side, and so on, everywhere. We don't know in which way microplastic enter in our body, which have postulated the 2 main hypothetical mechanisms, but we don't know. The majority of microplastic maybe came from alimentation, but there is a quote, a very high quote, also from upper and especially lower airways. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of study about the way in which microplastic enter in our body and reach every organ, especially placenta in the baby, because as Shauna told us before, prenatal exposure is more important than postnatal exposure. And this is especially important for microplastic. And so the question is, plastic and human health is a macro issue? Naturally, I think no, it's not a macro issue, because microplastic in environment can enter in our body from air, from gastrointestinal tract, and microplastic are taken from lymph node, go into systemic circulation, reach placenta, and in placenta, microplastic can change the transcriptional or neurological and vascular genes, and especially the energy metabolism pathway. And so we are in front of hypogenetic change. And so we can see a phenotypic change. In some animal, this is very clear. For example, in mice, in mice, microplastic are able to destroy energy formation, lipid disturbance, oxidative stress, and also a very important change of neurologic response. In a lot of animals of experimental, here also you can see metabolomic alteration in mice due to microplastic exposure. And as Shauna told before, biphenyl, I don't know the accent, but biphenyl is really dangerous for the trophoblast, for the formation of a new baby. You can see in this picture that biphenyl have the possibility to destroy the network of trophoblastic cell. The question is, in the next century, 5 to 10% of children live with a chronic disease. Till now, more than 14% of all children, half of the adolescent, and more than half of the adult under 6-5 years, living with a chronic disease. You can see in this slide a lot of chronic disease like autism, asthma, bipolar disorder, autoimmune pathology, and so on. A lot of this disease. More of these diseases are correlate with energy formation in the cell, and microplastic are able to destroy energy formation in the cells, especially in mitochondrial, in experimental animals. You can see here at the side the versicolor. Microplastic is able to have an accumulation in different sites in some tissue and change cellular expression in this tissue. Also in muscles. In muscles, microplastic have cellular effect, included alteration of immunological response, lysosomal compartment, peroximal proliferation, antioxidant system, neurotoxic effect, and so on. A lot of bad effect in muscles and with it muscles. Also, microplastic have the larvae of these little fish exposed to microplastic, as you can see in the slide, suffered a change of survival and a lot of alteration in length, weight, almost 6 times greater malformation than larvae don't expose it to microplastic. And so a couple of days before Nature published this question, this review that have as a title a question: microplastic are everywhere, but are they harmful? I think my personal answer is to this question is yes. If you can see the beautiful picture from David Lichwater from National Geographic that depict a little fish in between a lot of microplastic. Microplastic are harmful, and we must act fast if we don't want our life become like the little fish photographed by David Lichwater in National Geographic magazine. Perhaps I think the first thing to do is to stop buying liquids like water and soft drink in plastic bottles. Thank you for listening to me. I beg you, don't buy plastic bottles and use metal bottles. Is a little thing, a little bit change in our life, but I think can be a big change in all over the world, because the majority, as we show, as we see before, the majority of plastic came from bottle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ragusa. That was really comprehensive and helpful. If we can bring everyone back on the screen, I'd appreciate it. We covered a lot of territory in less than an hour, and I'm going to rapidly turn to some quick questions. First one from Dr. Scott Coffin, who studies microplastics at the California Water Board. His question is, are you aware of any lab studies showing impacts to male fertility from nanoparticles, microplastics, and particles in general? I'll direct that to either Dr. Ragusa or Dr. Swann. Would one of you like to attempt an answer?
I just want to say that I was kind of blown away by that presentation, Dr. Ragusa, really. And I had no idea that of the ratio of, the burden of plastic water bottles, particularly being so huge. So that's a takeaway for me. But as far as finding whether these affect male fertility specifically, I don't know that. There's no way that we could know that, I don't think. Unless it was an animal study, because we don't know where our human phthalates, other plastic components are coming from. We only know they're in our body, and then we know our behaviors. So making a link between those is very difficult.
Thank you. Our next question is fascinating, from Ramel Bellasilo. Many government environmental agencies are saying that the amount of these chemicals present in plastics are in such low dose that they don't consider it harmful. So the agencies oppose banning these chemicals or declaring plastics as toxics. Can anyone comment on that?
Well, I guess I have to comment on that, and maybe someone else can then also. But we know that very, very low doses of hormones affect the body. A good example of that is to see the amount a twin is affected by their co-twin in utero, or in animals, how a pup is affected by the residence of the uterus. Very, very low doses. And the problem is that our regulatory agency does not test for low doses. So they have not demonstrated harm from low doses, but if they generally, although many studies have, but not the regulatory studies, many studies have shown harm from low doses, but the regulatory agencies have to take these seriously.
Right. And I will add, as a former federal regulator, the agencies don't act with lightning speed, which is, we need to really pick up the pace here. The next question is for Dr. Ragusa from Megan Wolf. Are there endocrine disruptors that are known to affect lactation? For instance, begin lactation spontaneously or end it prematurely?
Paolo, help me.
Paolo, I think.
Ci sono degli endocrine disruptor che hanno effetti negativi sulla lattazione.
Sì, sì, certamente ci sono molti endocrine disruptor che hanno effetti negativi sulla lattazione, e le microplastiche possono veicolare questi distruttori dentro il corpo umano.
Yes, there is plenty of evidence there are effects, negative effects on lactations, and microplastic can enhance negative effects, also carrying other chemicals.
Thank you. Another question is from Marion Cartwright about the linings in cans of canned food. Maybe BPA-free could have substitutes that are just as dangerous. So this is for Shauna or Stacy. Is there any safe alternatives? Do cans have to be lined in the first place? For now, I understand we can simply use less canned foods. Any comment?
Well, this is a great example of what we call regrettable substitution, or sometimes called whack-a-mole, when a product is labeled, for example, BPA-free, and the manufacturer instead puts in a substitute like BPF or BPS, or now some other ones are coming along, and don't label them. So the consumer thinks they're buying a safe product, but in fact they're being tricked. And this is something that's not possible if the chemical has to be shown to be safe before it's put into the marketplace. As far as safe alternatives, I believe there are, because there are some companies who seem to be very environmentally conscious that do put out canned food, but why not buy your products in glass? Would be the safest, I would say.
Thank you. And from Marina Ivlev, testosterone was discussed, but is there also an effect on estrogen as well? Do chemicals in plastics cause an increase in estrogen?
I don't know if Dr. Ragusa wants to address that.
Hai capito? Hanno detto, avete discusso del testosterone, ma quali sono gli effetti sugli estrogeni?
Ah, sì, molto importante. La plastica e le microplastiche e i distruttori endocrini che ricoprono le microplastiche sono in grado di alterare le concentrazioni degli estrogeni e anche di cambiare la risposta dei recettori. Quindi sicuramente ci sono molti effetti negativi anche sugli estrogeni e quindi sulla femminilità in generale.
Yes, so it is plenty of evidence that microplastics and chemicals that are carried with microplastics change the level of estrogens and also the binding to the receptors. Therefore, there is a multiple effects you can have on female sex hormones and female sexuality.
Thank you. And this is for Dr. Swann from Sandy Lamotte. Dr. Swann, it appears that the only way to protect a baby from the toxins in the environment today is to put pregnant women in a bubble, free of chemicals before conception, and provide organic food. Since that's not possible, what can a pregnant woman do to protect her health? Is there a time in pregnancy or before when these actions are most important?
Well, I'll just say a little bit, and then maybe Stacy can chime in on some things the pregnant woman can do. But I would say, is there a most important time? I would say that for the man, because it takes sperm 70 to 90 days to be produced, those days prior to conception are really sensitive for the man. For the woman, I have to say there are many developmental systems in the body that are not being finalized in their development in the first trimester. Certainly the brain goes on till the 21 years of age, I think, in development. So we can't say the first trimester is for every system is the most important, but it's certainly very important for many systems. So if I had to focus on one time in pregnancy, I would say probably from weeks 8 to 12 would be the most sensitive. Stacy, do you want to talk about some protections the woman could
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So my advice would be to steer clear of all cigarette smoke, both in terms of active smoking and secondhand smoke, thirdhand smoke. Eat as many organic vegetables and fruits as you can. Avoid plastics in your kitchen in particular. Look for safe cosmetics, and the Environmental Working Group is a reputable organization for that information. You want to avoid phthalates and other chemicals in your cosmetic products and personal care items. So I would say those are the top things. And if you live in a high pollution area, avoid high pollution days outside, stay in, or wait until the pollution counts go down to go outside. And basically take everyday commonsensical measures to protect yourself.
Thank you. And here's an interesting question. Which special interest groups, both in the United States and throughout the world, are vested in continuing to manufacture products that are clearly hazardous and ecocidal?
I think you should answer that, Judith.
Sure. Yeah, it's the petrochemical industry and their fleet of lobbyists in Washington. I would specifically point to the American Chemistry Council. If you look at their website, they vigorously argue against reducing the use of plastic, even in food packaging, and they minimize the health risks. And they say the solution to the plastic waste problem is something called chemical recycling, which is proven not to work around the country. So I think the question's important. It recognizes that there are financial interests that are very committed to increasing the production and use of plastic. It's chemical companies and it's fossil fuel companies. Because remember, early on, I mentioned that plastic production is the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. So that's just a general response. We have time for one more question. Let's see, from Dave Pueblo, our skin is highly absorbent. It seems that all skin lotion products come in plastic containers. The few that come in glass come with a plastic pump. Is there a non-plastic option? Is it better to start making lotions yourself or simply doing without? Stacy or Shauna?
Yeah, well, I think we should remember that one of the purposes of phthalates and one of the reasons they are actually put into the product is because that increases the absorbency of the product on your skin. So they're going to be in there no matter what kind of container it's in. So when you buy a product that's in a plastic container, you have a double whammy, if you will. You're getting it in the product and you're getting it through the container. So I think worrying about the container and maybe getting things in glass is a good idea, but also worry about what's in the product itself.
Really good point. So as I mentioned, we've covered a lot of ground in an hour. This has been fascinating. I cannot thank Dr. Swann, Dr. Ragusa, Stacy Colino, and Paulo enough for your time here. We will put this recording on the Beyond Plastics website. So that's beyondplastics.org, plural on plastic. We'll also ask Shauna and Antonio for their PowerPoints, if you don't mind. We'll post that. And if you haven't been paying attention, go get this book. There's a whole chapter on plastics. There's the big picture for policymakers, and there's also very practical information about what we can do as consumers. Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you again to our brilliant presenters. Beyond Plastics, I thank all of you.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody.
Nice to see everybody.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Have a good day.